Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Sadly, here I am 2 years into doing this thing, and we're still wrapped in a pandemic. Speaking of, the subject of the day is the Doomsday Clock and its new setting. And for a lot of people, these last weeks and months, it's been hard to shake that sense of despair, if not doom. We're on an overheating planet. The planetary boundaries people just yesterday put out another paper. I think it's iffy on a new planetary boundary. They've added plastics. I'm going to do a whole session on it because I think they're kind of mixing up bowling balls and plastic bags. Not every plastic is the same. Um, but let's not talk about that today. This is Andy Revkin. This is the Columbia Climate School Earth Institute Sustain What webcast. We're going to get right into it here with three people who were part of the release today of the 75th year of this University of Chicago spawned Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists publication of a doomsday clock, an estimate of an aggregation of risk, and with some sense of where the hotspots are. And here, I guess there's good news and bad news today. We'll hear from Sharon and from Dan and from Ray, and then we'll get into it with Bina Venkataraman from the Boston Globe, who's the editorial page editor and author of a great book, Optimist Telescope, with Michele Wucker, who is author of several really important books on this. And we'll talk about your books in a minute. The Gray Rhino was your kickoff into the public sphere, I think, at least for me. And Jeff Schlegelmilch, who is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia, and whose latest book this year is Rethinking Readiness in a World of Megadisaster. But let's just go right into it. Maybe Sharon, tell us who you are, what's your role there, and what's your role in life when you're not part of the Doomsday rollout. And the thumbnail results would be great. And then we'll get to Dan and Ray.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us. I'm a research professor. I'm actually a political scientist at George Washington University. And I am co-chair, along with Daniel Holtz, of the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. So the thumbnail, I mean, what I really do, my passion is mountain biking, but we don't have to talk about that right now. We have set the clock at this year at 100 seconds to midnight, and which is the same that it was set last year and the year before. But I'm here to tell you that no change is not good news, because 100 seconds is awfully close to midnight. I guess
for context, tell the context is historically it's been in minutes, down to 2 minutes, up to 17.
Exactly right. And it was a few years ago when we decided. I think we moved from 3 minutes to 2.5 minutes. I can't remember exactly when. It was a big step for us. We're running out of real estate as we get closer to midnight. And of course, this is not, there's no computer algorithm. This is, it is a metaphor. But we do look at the array of existential challenges and up and coming challenges in disruptive technologies. So mostly nuclear weapons, climate change, biosecurity, and AI, you name it. The disruptive threats is kind of a grab bag of different things that we look at. Right. So the furthest it's been away from midnight was at the end of the Cold War, 17 minutes to midnight. And now we have been at the closest it has been for 3 years. And of course, now we, in addition to nuclear weapons, we look at climate change and all the other things that I mentioned.
We'll get to the culture part in a minute. I flicked the wrong button on my machine. I'm still here, by the way. My camera seems to be going into main mode. I'm in rural Maine. Yeah, so we've been stuck for 3 years, and the first of those 3 years was actually just before the pandemic, right? It came out in January of 2020. So it didn't really fully integrate the pandemic yet. And I think in my reading of what was released maybe last year, there was an argument that the pandemic is hugely disruptive, et cetera, but not quite at the category of thing that you feel is existential, which might be one reason it hasn't gotten worse. Dan, can you introduce yourself and weigh in a little bit too?
Yeah, hi. So thanks for doing this and having me on. So I'm Daniel Holtz. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago in physics and astronomy, and I'm co-chair with Sharon of this Science and Security Board at the Bulletin. And I spent most of my time thinking about black holes and astrophysics and cosmology, the kind of big questions. But it turns out these are also big and important questions. And so I've become quite engaged. And so the issue of the pandemic, I think it's very instructive to think about the pandemic. The Bulletin is mostly focused on what we think of as existential threats. And you could argue that at least COVID-19, the way it's presenting is not an existential threat in the sense that it may not, spell the end of civilization in and of itself. Now, we'll see how there could be other pandemics. You can imagine pandemics that could be an existential threat, but at least so far, COVID is not in that bucket. But what it is it's extraordinarily instructive as to humanity's ability to address existential threats. And I think in that the lessons have been, sobering and somewhat depressing. You say, here's a threat, we see it in front of us. People are dying in the millions. There are things we can do as a society to mitigate this threat. Some of it is simple, like wearing masks. We can use our technology to develop vaccines and then deploy them. The potential is very high. But then in practice, you look at the way the world has reacted, and it's a very mixed record. Given that the threat is right in front of us, the fact that some people don't even believe it's a threat, that it's become extremely politicized, that the world's approach has been, at best haphazard, does not give one confidence that for more abstract threats like climate change, where the worst is down the road and we need to make the investments now, that the world will come together. So I think in that sense, the pandemic has been very important as a data point for humanity as to where we are now and where we need to be to address truly existential threats.
Yeah, I'd like to do let's go around the circle here a little bit and end with Ray. Ray, I want to get to you too, obviously on the main thrust, but there are two things about the pandemic. One, you make a point in your report. Oh, here we go again. Sorry, I'm still here. I'm not in Svalbard where that picture was taken. There are two things about the report that relate powerfully to the problem of the pandemic and how this could be perceived as leading to some existential questions about us. One is the behavioral divisions and how they've been amplified by technology. The hacking of the information sphere is a big part of a chunk of what you guys wrote about. And what I think about all the time, how do you make information matter? That's what you've been trying to do since 1947. And I write blah, 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 bang, that phrase over and over and over again, dealing with risk of all kinds. The other thing is selfishness. The vaccine gaps on both planetary and within the United States or within any country are just astounding. And the level of selfishness, which is the antithesis of what, the most deeply thinking sustainability people I talk about getting out of yourself or expanding your sense of self to include the community. And those are the things that really bum me out. So maybe, Jeff, I know you have to leave fairly quickly. So could you just introduce yourself and sort of get at whether, what's your sense of the hashtag that the Bulletin folks have put out, which is how do we turn back the clock? How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that reports like this do an important job of kind of raising attention, both at sort of the simplicity of, the clip we're headed towards, and the complexity of the reasoning behind it, and to kind of dig deeper into all of that. I was actually at a congressional hearing yesterday, testifying, and we were talking about this very point as well too, on how when it comes to disaster management and disaster preparedness, we spend all this money on the back end on response and recovery because that's where the incentives are. That's where the electoral incentives are. So the political science sort of drives you in one direction in terms of a certain kind of behavior, when the disaster science drives you in another. In this case, it was the House Committee on Rules, the subcommittee on legislative and budget process. And so looking at recommendations on rules that can kind of counterbalance some of those incentives. But what the pandemic is showing us too is that that it's not just about the biological science, it's about the behavioral science. Why do certain approaches work differently in different parts of the world? Well, there are actually some very significant differences in culture that are going to make some strategies more effective in some parts of the world than the others. How you communicate to some groups is different than in others. And even within the United States, or within any country, there are subgroups, some more marginalized than others, going to be more trusting in information than others. And so I think we need to lean into this complexity, and in particular to the behavioral science, to the political science, and this notion that science has an answer. It's like, no, there's lots of sciences, and they illuminate different parts of the picture, and the whole of it sort of gives you more adaptable strategies based on place and context.
Thank you. And Michele, what are you thinking? When you think about Doomsday, this presentation, this annual ritual, there's a performative aspect to it. I think it's helpful. As I've said, Steven Pinker makes good points, but that doesn't mean this is a right or wrong thing. It means diversity of ways of conveying risk is vital on a complicated planet. But you've written several books digging in on these questions. What comes to mind on a day like this? Stuck on 100 seconds.
I think about the time element, that the farther away something is, the more likely we are to ignore it. And the closer it is, the more likely we are to do something, although not everybody's going to do anything. So I think the clock is an amazing image for that. And I think, Jeff's comments about needing to tailor messages differently for different parts of the world is so important. In You Are What You Risk, I write about how different countries have different sensitivities to risk. Some countries pay attention more. Some countries are comfortable with different levels of different kinds of risks, and people in some countries are willing to do something or not. And I think we need to be much more aware of those regional differences as we try to get everybody engaged in rewinding the clock.
Yes, and we'll talk more about this in a second. Bina, you have so many interesting lenses on this. And your book, the Optimist Telescope, is one. Again, on this day, I don't know if you guys have done anything lately in the GlobalOpinion section on the question of existential question, but where's your head and heart at today?
Well, I think it's useful in order to wrap our heads around some things that happen at the scale of humanity, civilization level collapse, or to contemplate big problems like climate change. We need sort of these, right? We need visuals, we need metaphors, we need anchors for our imagination in order to help us better relate to these things. And it's interesting, we will run op-eds in the GlobalOpinion pages about some of the risks or threats of climate change, for example. And there's this kind of, there's kind of Chicken Little effect to constantly saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And of course, we see the threats of climate change manifest as actual consequences and disasters more and more now. And so people, I think, really feel the reality of that. But when you keep saying that at a sort of planetary scale, how do you get people to really think about it? And so, similar to, I think of the blue marble image from space, right, really anchoring and bringing together a movement, the environmental movement, bringing about and helping instigate and inspire Earth Day, because of that perspective at scale that people could get through seeing Earth from that place. And I think there's something similar a similar function of the Doomsday Clock in helping people understand that there is someone looking at the level of threat at the scale of what is the threat to civilization as a whole, not what's the threat to me here or what's happening in the stock market, not what's happening in this community or this particular sector, or even what's happening in this particular country, what the GDP of that country is. So I think it's useful to have these other kinds of anchors that we can hold in contrast to some of the typical ways that we measure whether we're getting closer to disaster or whether we're making progress. That said, I'm really happy that it's being talked about as a metaphor and not a metric, because I think part of the challenge we can have when we lock ourselves on singular metrics is that we ignore risks. And the idea that there are existential risks is something that, of course, is hard for people to contemplate, important for people to contemplate. There are existential risks that are not technology oriented, like an asteroid hitting the Earth. If you have watched Adam McKay's Don't Look Up, you're probably thinking about that very existential threat right now. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should focus all our attention on low probability, high impact events. There are plenty of non-civilizational ending events that are really, really big threats, including many of the impacts of climate change, right? So on a more immediate time scale, there are threats from climate change that include the displacement of refugees, economic collapse of entire societies, of entire economies. There are threats including destruction of real estate, destruction of lives, farms, forests, and that isn't necessarily going to end civilization, but those are sort of intermediate threats that we need to be thinking about, intermediate level risks. And similarly, pandemics, right? Any given pandemic might not end civilization as we know it, but we need to focus attention on that. So I think in context, a tool like this is useful. I do wonder whether the metaphor of the clock is actually the right metaphor. I really take and agree with what Michele said about the need for imminence in making threats more salient in people's minds. We struggle with long-term threats and long-term thinking. But part of what I think can confuse people is does this mean we're actually closer to existential destruction in time, or are we actually just headed on that trajectory? And I think it can be hard for people to wrestle with which of those things is it.
That's a good moment to circle back to the folks in the team. Ray, you've been very patient, and you have a new book out on planetary systems, which include the human system now. So what's your thinking? Oh, actually, your audio is a little screwy.
Oh, is my audio sounding okay now?
No, there's some kind of bad static.
So let's see. Let's try.
Try. Double check which microphone setting which mic.
Yeah, well, let me try it with the.
Here, and I'm just going to mute you for a second, just so it's not.
Yeah, is that better?
Oh yeah, actually, there you go.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I switched to the onboard microphone instead of my outboard microphone. Anyway, yeah. So with regard to the clock as a metaphor, in some ways the clock metaphor works better for global warming than it does for nuclear. Because there is a definite metric to how close we are to disaster. And that's because carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. So every ton of carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere each year brings us that much closer to the existential level of risks of climate change. And so the only real metric as to whether we're making more progress, as I said this morning, is whether we are on a track to stop emitting CO2 and how soon we can do that. So, but in communication of the magnitude of this problem, we're always walking the line between telling people just how serious the problem is, that this is not something far off. This is a really serious and current problem, and risking demotivating people by what my colleague Mike Mann calls doomism. Because in fact, now that the skeptics have not been able to cast doubt on the science, especially now that there's a Nobel Prize for global warming that's been given, they sort of part of that community has turned over to saying, well, it's too late to do anything. We're all going down the tube, so might as well just have a party because that boat has sailed. But that's not the case. We still have time to do things, And even if we sail past the 2 degrees C warming threshold, it's still worthwhile keeping warming from going to 4 degrees, which we could do if we burned all the coal, and even worse. So, this mix of the message of sort of imminent problem that is not really far off, but also that there really is hope in the system. There are things we can do. These are things we can do. Humanity has limitless capability to solve problems of this sort. This is not a hopeless thing. But trying to convey the sense of urgency while at the same time giving people the realistic sense of hope that we can do this. That's a really tricky communication problem. It's one we always walk when doing this.
For sure, and that's why I was pleased to see this year the focus on kind of a call to the audience to what are the things you think about you can do? What are examples of what is working around you? The one thing that gives me hope is, well, many things do, is when I turn my own focus away from thresholds and boundaries and numbers like 1.5 and 2 or 350 and toward capacities. And I see this every day at the scale of communities or at the scale when something magically gets through Congress, like a more than $1 trillion bill on infrastructure. That required negotiation, it required people to step back from their direct interest, people to sort of cooperate. And I see this at the community scale all the time in Jeff's arena. So maybe we could shift to this. And for those who come here today from the Bulletin, what prompted this? I know you've probably done things like this before, but seem more sort of in the foreground this time. Maybe, sorry, Sharon.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've been talking about this amongst ourselves for quite a while, but there's been some pretty good research recently about people's reactions to these messages of doom, right? It's not helpful. It's not, it doesn't turn folks into activism. And I think, you know, when you come from the community that looks at nuclear weapons, you know, we've got 75 years and the threat has not, and we even have through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, commitments by at least 5 of the nuclear weapon states to work towards eventual nuclear disarmament, right? Those commitments are 50 years old, half a century old, right? So how do you energize or energize folks to look at what is, you know, looks like a seemingly hopeless project, right? Because the countries that have nuclear weapons are quite convinced that they provide security, that they're not destabilizing. And so I think that's somewhat behind the social media campaign, but also there's been a lot more emphasis on, I mean, communications technology allows us to do this, right? Now we can crowdsource solutions for a lot of different things. It's the bulletins, one way that we reach out to our audience and energize them and seek solutions. It's not, you know, a tremendous amount of money is spent on nuclear weapons by a few countries, right? It's not most of the countries in the world. There are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons that place, you know, I was struck by, I guess, something that you said earlier about, you know, looking at COVID, selfishness, right? There are 9 countries that place the rest of the world on this precipice because, you know, depending on how you view the probability of having a large, you know, scale nuclear war, but there are scenarios where you could have accidental or inadvertent nuclear use. Sorry, I forgot where I was going with that. So it's
selfishness,
right? Selfishness. So when these countries, which are among the most, you know, powerful in in the world spending trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons. For the average citizen, it seems hard to get a handle on that. But I think the answer is, and we put this at the end of our Doomsday Clock statement, particularly with respect to climate change, but it applies equally to nuclear weapons. You need to ask all of your leaders, political, religious, social, and educators, what are you doing about this problem?
And Bina, you deal with the whole range of issues as the editorial page editor. It was important there just to understand that I think in today's assessment from the Bulletin, climate change is there, but it's not it's Russian-U.S. relations at a time of brinkmanship. And at an incredible time, Russia's racing to develop new weapons. You've got Europe, because of fossil dependence, not standing up to Russia because they use Russian gas. And how do you go through the day in terms of how you shape your side of what a newspaper writes, given those complexities?
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
So I have to say that Doomsday is often on my mind, more as the author of the Optimist telescope and as someone who worked in climate policy in the Obama years, and less so from the context of every editorial or piece of writing has to address the threat of ultimate existential crisis. That said, we've taken positions on the Nord Stream 2, trying to argue that the US government should pressure Germany to not put this natural gas pipeline ahead of protecting the interests of democracy in Ukraine and resisting the expansionary influence of Russia. So we take positions on all these issues of the day, but often in a way that's very responsive to sort of what is that immediate concern. And I do think, at any given moment of time, any number of issues that are happening in the world, whether they're national security issues or whether they're environmental issues or an explosion, when we saw that volcano erupt in Tonga, people were watching and waiting to see how bad is this going to be? How bad are the tsunamis going to be? How destructive is that going to be? So can be at any moment in time, you could take a cross section of these issues and ask, what is the existential threat posed to humanity by this set of geopolitical, economic, and environmental factors? And I think that's an interesting lens to put on it that the Bulletin is putting on it. But I was really interested to look back into the history of the Bulletin and realize that, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the clock wasn't changed. And for many people, looking back at Cold War history, that was sort of the moment that we came closest to nuclear annihilation. And so I think one of the things we have to think about and recognize is that, the linear progression of a clock or even of threats or even of social and political change that responds to crisis, and I think about this a lot in the context of climate change, it's not, it can be nonlinear, the actual dynamics that shift something for the better. Often we reach these tipping points where then there is a political response to that. And we see that, whether it's in democratic protest movements that come and emerge, right? When you saw the fall of the wall, the Velvet Revolution and all of that. And so I think it's hard to say that at any moment in time, we know that a future risk, a future existential threat is going to happen. And I think that to me is a source of optimism and sort of, I would say, pragmatic optimism in that, while this threat of doomsday is there, and if you look at those short-term indicators, which we're constantly covering in the news, we're constantly reinforcing in our readers' minds that there are these imminent threats that could end the world. And so I take responsibility for that, adding to that cultural kind of doomsaying as a sort of news editor. But when we kind of really look at the way that change happens over history and the moments where we thought doom was imminent, like the Cuban Missile Crisis or otherwise, what we see is that there are ways in which either by serendipity or by social and political change or by these kind of tipping point moments where people respond, whether it's through a protest movement, a climate movement, or something else, that we can actually reverse the course of what looks almost inevitable.
There's so much to talk about here. Yeah, Daniel and then Ray.
Yeah, I just want to amplify that message, and I think it's very interesting. That the missile crisis is a great example because at that time it really was close, and there's been a number of things that have come out over the years of just how close it was. There were many different incidents at that time that easily could have spiraled into nuclear exchange. But indeed, at the end of all that, it was so alarming that it actually ended up resulting in a bunch of measures that probably made the world safer. And so over the long term, having gone through that, we started to move away from midnight. And I think, as a metaphor, it's the right metaphor. We moved away from the brink. Now, having said all that, I think it's important just to emphasize that right now, at least as far as the experts on the Bulletin board are concerned, this is the closest we've ever been, even closer than we were then. And there is you don't want to be alarmist, and would all much rather have it be much further away. This is not where any of us want to be. But considering everything, the state of nuclear, the state of the information ecosystem, and the debates, and you just look at what's happening every day in the paper. You look at Ukraine. When you tie all this stuff together, it's hard not to be terrified. That being said, the whole goal is to get us away, and I think this is the important point: is where do you go from here? You have to make people aware. But you don't want to make them despondent. You want to result in action. And that, going back to this initial thing of how do we get people engaged, informed, and then moving where we want to go, that's part of this turn back the clock. And it's part of the whole point of this exercise.
Yeah, and Hank Green made an important point in your presentations today here that you guys highlighted on Twitter. The greatest power has always been and will always be our words, our ideas, our stories. And I think our capacities. I want to ask you whether technology is harming or hurting. I think historically, the Bulletin process focused on technologies, emergent ones, genetic, nuclear, and yet, like at COP26, when I wrote about the summary of COP26, it was technology, like remote sensing satellites that can monitor methane, that is pushing countries to have more ambitious actions, including deforestation. You can now measure more precisely the value or limits of afforestation. And I see many, many examples where technology could be leading us towards solutions, but we tend to focus on the dark side there too. Is it always going to be a double-edged sword? Ray, I know you had your hand up before. Maybe you have something to say on that too.
Yeah, actually, I do have something to say about technology and resilience versus vulnerability. But I wanted to roll back to the comment that was made about Nord Stream 2 and the European energy crisis, because the European energy crisis and the way it interacts with relations with Russia and the difficulty of putting pressure on Russia is an excellent example of the linkage between the climate crisis and broader geopolitical crises, because the reason Europe is in a pickle over natural gas is so much of Europe has dragged its feet on renewables and on energy efficiency. So Sweden, which decarbonized its home heating long ago and mostly relies on district heating, burns very little natural gas is relatively unaffected by the increase in price of natural gas. And while the UK in general has done pretty well with holding on its carbon dioxide emissions, its housing stock has been neglected for decades. And this is another linkage to inequality. It's the poor people who suffer most from this, and they live in houses that are poorly insulated. They get no help from the government in improving the energy efficiency of their home heating. And so Europe would not be in this pickle, but especially the UK would not be in a problem with regard to their being beholden to Russia for natural gas. If action had been taken on decarbonization, specifically increasing home heating energy efficiency and increasing the role of district heating and renewable energy, heat pumps, that sort of thing, If we had solved the climate crisis, if we had solved the emissions problem, progress in the emissions problem, 10 years ago, we'd be in a much better position to confront Russia.
Yeah, although part of that, of course, is Germany not doing what Sweden did, and Germany's turning off its nuclear power plants, and Sweden.
Well, yes, actually, there are many lessons from Sweden, where Sweden, though they have a very strong Green Party, decided they were not going to turn off nuclear until they could replace it with the renewables, and so Germany, in fact, has continued its reliance on coal just because they foolishly turned off nuclear before they were ready to replace it.
So I want to get back to the individual, and Michele Wucker, I'm really impressed with your most recent book, where you kind of, sorry, I'm trying to turn off the phone here. Again, I'm in my mother-in-law's house. Recognizing in one's own self your reactions to risk at various levels feels like a really important starting point in terms of determining who feels like a doomist or an optimist. It just the more I looked at how you do that, the more it felt valuable. So could you just kind of bring that lens here?
Well, this sense of personal agency is so important. And I think on some of these big global issues, it's really tough because they seem so big that each person feels like they can't contribute much. And, when I turn off that light switch when I leave the room, I'm making a contribution that no matter how small it is, it's part of, I'm one of many billions of people who has to do something to change that. And one of the reasons that people don't always respond to the big scary gray rhino right in front of them, is that they feel helpless, this learned helplessness. And so I think that the more we can emphasize what do we do, it's one of the things that was so great about the way the Bulletin couches the Doomsday Clock, and that here's the things that need to happen. But as much as we can do on the individual level as we can is important. I get so mad at these journalists who come out and say, don't ask what I can do because it's the government's and it's the business's response. It's everybody's. You can't leave one group out. And if businesses see that citizens want renewables and clean products, they're going to respond. If governments see that citizens want climate action, they're going to see it. So if anyone who is watching this has been guilty of that, don't ask what I could do it myself. Please, 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 stop it. But that sense of agency, and I think a sense of global agency is important too, and a connection globally. All these other top risks reports have been coming out recently, and climate change is way up top. I mean, some huge percentage of the top 10 of the World Economic Forum's global risk reports were climate related this year. Pew Global Attitudes, you see huge concern over climate change, huge concern over weapons of mass destruction. So the citizens of the world are seeing that these are the big problems. But the more each citizen can see that, hey, somebody in that country on the other side of the world also cares about this and also is doing something about it. It's what the sociologist Ulrich Beck talks about as a sort of a global cosmopolitan response to human caused risks.
Sorry, go.
I was just going to respond to that because I love this comment, Michele, and I think so often we act as if it's mutually exclusive for government and systems to respond to problems and individuals to respond to problems. And in fact, you're pointing out that they're in symbiosis and in fact, often necessary to reinforce each other. Particularly, we need citizens and democracies or consumers to make those decisions. And I think on climate in particular, there's been sort of a missing link because it does feel like when I switch off that light switch, I'm not doing enough. It feels like almost meaningless. So there are times when I know I can switch off the light switch, but it's sort of like, oh my God, if everyone else on Earth isn't doing this, or if I still have to think about what the fossil fuel companies who've bought off my Congress people are doing, does it really even matter? Do I need to get up and switch up the light switch? And I think that we need some, cognitive bridges. So this idea of the cosmopolitanism makes a lot of sense to me, but I think also a sense of scale. So when we act as individuals alone in our homes, it might not matter, but where do we affect communities? So we all have workplaces or neighborhoods or synagogues or churches or larger communities of peers and professionals where we can actually make an impact that it can be more powerful and look more significant than the individual level, but is still not yet at the level of affecting policy change, which takes more work, sort of at the global level or at the national level. And so I think we need more and more of those kinds of experiences. And some of the behavioral economics reinforces this, the idea of behavioral contagion. If I do things and other people observe them, then that multiplies. Well, then how can we give people the information of how their action has multiplied to change how multiple other people act, whether they put up solar panels and how they behave. And to see the snowball effect of that, I think can help motivate people to overcome this sense of lack of agency and disengagement with the future.
I do think this is where I'm going to circle back to technology, which, you know, we all loathe what we've heard about social media companies that have done so much damage through the algorithms that take us to the worst parts of ourselves, addict us to the edge, to drama, to doom. They literally take us down into that hole where you're dragged down by the black hole pull of that part of our personalities. But then technology can do amazing things. In Canada, there's this, I love this website. I'm going to do a session with these folks soon, where you can look at the positive, just as Bina was saying. You can build awareness of options across communities. You know, look, we all have solar panels over here. It's kind of cool. This is our budget. You know, it saves us money. And not only that, they use infrared imagery to say that our home is less leaky now than it used to be. So we're saving energy, which gets at what Ray was saying earlier. But when you present that to the world, and if you can make it viral and make it, sticky and positive, there's enormous potential there. It's going to take work because, again, so many of these systems are designed to take us in the other direction. And, you know, one reason I'm willing to work, my blog is run on a Facebook platform, and they do pay me some money. So I'm, dealing with them in that way, but I'm hoping that we can build some of that potentiality out more. These things do still have more than one capacity. So I don't know whether, and I like to end these sessions. We have more time here, but I'll sort of foreshadow the idea of, I always ask people before I end a webcast, what can we do together better than what we can do individually? Is there some little tack we can pursue here, going forward? Not just another session, but looking at bring someone else on to talk about some of these experiments that can turn the clock back in some meaningful way. And the other thing I'll observe here is, and this is what my impression of the value of the Bulletin is, it's so many of our moments in life, whether it's in our family, in our community, in our politics, come down to these pinch points, real moments where, and again, luckily we threaded the needle on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but what are the capacities we can build? There's sort of like circuit breakers, or at various levels, so that a marriage might not end in a divorce, or throwing a projectile, or you won't see fractiousness around masking, or you could get Congress to commit to passing a certain piece of legislation, even when each side is dead set against some aspects of it. I don't know if does that resonate with you, Sharon and Daniel, particularly? Do I feel that part of the Bulletin project correctly?
Absolutely. On not to get too technical on you with nuclear weapons, but there are certainly some circuit breakers that we need. We've talked for a long time about the fact that it is the reaction time for leaders to make a decision about whether or not to launch is way too short. So, in the United States, we could put some, fire breaks in there so that it's not just a single person who makes the decision to launch. Yeah. There are other very kind of technical things that can happen. But just to loop back to your point about what can we do together, nuclear weapons don't exist in a vacuum, and they're not, developed just because they're fantastic. We need to. They are really scientifically, they're pretty astounding.
Amazing. It's true.
But no, we cannot get ourselves out of this hole without talking to the Russians, without talking seriously about the kinds of things that they see as threats, that we see as threats, that the Chinese see as threats. So that whole, multilateral diplomacy is very, very hard, but very, very necessary.
And Dan,
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that. So, I think it's interesting. One of the kind of founding principles of the Bulletin is that, it's exactly what you said. It's technology is a double-edged sword. It has an immense destructive power, as we see with nuclear weapons, or in some sense the technological age is the reason for climate change. But then it also has all this power for good, and there's a kind of this belief in human ingenuity, and we can solve these problems. And I think if you ask anyone at the Bulletin, or really most people that study any of these things, these are problems that we can solve. There's nothing that says climate change can't be addressed and that we can't end up in a better place than we are now, maintaining our standard of living in a certain way. This is not an insoluble problem. We just have to try. We have to, dedicate our resources and dedicate our time and our efforts, and we'll get there. And I think that's related to what Bina and Michele have been saying, which is, a lot of this is nonlinear. The issues here are not fundamentally technological. They're sociological or psychological, or having to do with just getting us all, together, moving in the right direction. And it is a highly nonlinear process, I think. And I think some of the things that give me hope is just looking around, especially if you talk to young people. There is an awareness of that climate change is a threat. It's something people worry about and want to engage in and want to make a difference. And that's the first step. And so I think at this point, most of the world doesn't, acknowledges that this is something that we have to come together to address. So now it's only a question of finding the right paths and having that pressure grow and end up in change. And it's starting to happen, but probably not fast enough and not broadly enough. So we just keep pushing at all levels, and hopefully we get there.
In buying time, that idea of buying time, one thing that I've been trying to think about is, and this relates, Michele, to your book, your Gray Rhino book. Are there positive gray rhinos? I think the book is framed around negative. Gray rhinos are threats that hide in plain sight. But are there positives that hide in plain sight?
Absolutely. And actually, I felt a little bit guilty about portraying the rhino as a danger, since humans are more of a danger to rhinos than they are to us. But one of the things that I talk to people about is, what do you see the rhino coming at you? What are you going to do? You can get out of the way, maybe let someone else get trampled. You do nothing, you get trampled yourself. Or here's the thing with this massive power and strength that you can harness. You can give people the sense of urgency to deal with a change. It's an emotional metaphor. And so, with climate change, you look at, what if we could switch to all renewables, to clean energy, not have to deal with asthma? I mean, I have asthma, so I'm really pro no asthma, no pollution. But, there are lots of good things that can come out of solving a problem. And in fact, every venture capitalist that's looking at pitch decks, what do they want to know? What's the problem you're solving for? So absolutely, exactly. It's the both sides of things. It's the danger and the opportunity, and they go together.
You're leading me back to something I've been writing about a lot. Is different than the gray rhino. It's kind of when we think we're looking at a rhino and we're actually looking at a different species. Climate change, that phrase, Ray's body of work on the physics of the atmosphere, has been in the foreground for decades. 35 years of me writing about it. 80% has been about CO2 is rising in the atmosphere. It's changing things in ways that are going to hurt us or are already hurting us. And I did not put vulnerability in the foreground, meaning climate vulnerability. And the more I do, the more I see opportunities to extend our timescale of getting this problem less wrong. The people who are vulnerable on this planet to extreme weather are not on this call. They're in Durban, and I had a scientist on here who studies urban flooding in Durban, and guess who's living in floodplains in Durban? It's immigrants, it's the dispossessed, it's the prejudiced. They're in the areas that are vulnerable. Societal problems are the problem. Climate change is a background driver of one of the aspects of risk, but not the primary driver of loss. Even now, the work of Lauren Bowers, who's been on here many times, and social science has taken the back seat instead of being at least an equal party in the IPCC process and on. And when you start to look at climate vulnerability, what can we do to reduce vulnerability? Whether it's the people I've talked to in Boulder about building standards that were clearly needed, the forest, the scientists who know urban fire risk know that was an urban fire in Boulder, near Boulder. It was not a forest fire or a grass fire. The grass fire jumped into a town, and it was the town that created the calamity. And the more you look at that, the more we're surrounded by opportunities that can then give us more time to address the long-term gray rhino, which is the CO2 buildup. And I think that, to me, is the one thing. That's why I spend so much time writing about climate risk, meaning what can we do now in communities today to get this less wrong, even as we work on this grand scale thing. And that I would like to see that kind of be even the way if we frame next year's bulletin around vulnerability and less around the hazard. It might be interesting. We could talk about that. There's many people who could weigh in. Ray. Yeah, Ray.
Yeah, well, addressing vulnerability, or what people call adaptation, that's what we're going to have to do because we have not decarbonized fast enough.
Wait. I'm not talking about adaptation to climate change. That is a totally different question. I'm talking about vulnerability to climate hazards.
Right. Part of the increase in CO2 increases the level of climate hazards, and
not for tornadoes, not always.
But the fact is that there are limits to how much you can address the climate change issue by decreasing vulnerability. Of course, decreasing vulnerability is something you need to do, but that shouldn't be conflated with the issue of what we need to do to actually stop the increasing risks from increasingly bad climates. If it gets to the point where you have levels of heat and humidity in Durban, which people cannot survive outdoors because the body can no longer cool off in those conditions, then it's really hard to do anything to reduce the vulnerability. And so while I'm sympathetic to the notion that there's a big linkage to inequality and the level of climate vulnerability, generally speaking, out there, some people like Roger Pielke Jr. just have done a lot of damage by giving the impression that, well, actually global warming isn't a big deal. It's all a matter of sociology. So some of it is a matter of sociology, but it's still a big deal. The climate change is a big deal, and it's not something that can be swept under the rug in talking about vulnerability.
No, and we're not going to. We'll do a whole session on Roger someday. But the key thing, I think, you kind of illustrated what I'm talking about. You're conflating climate change and climate risk. Climate change is one driver of risk, and I could take you around the world to show you, from Germany's flood zones to the Colorado fire zones, that risk is still largely a function of exposure and vulnerability. And climate change matters. It's one facet of an enormous challenge, and they have to be dealt with. And if you want to have anything play out in your lifetime that actually saves a person, you're talking about vulnerability reduction, not CO2 reduction. They both have to happen. They're two different problems.
I wouldn't say that they're two different problems, because if we don't solve the CO2 problem, we'll get into levels of vulnerability that no societal responses are able to deal with.
Of course.
So I really disagree with you on this, Andy. I think this is, and I think actually trying to imply that these are two different problems, and that the fact that carbon dioxide increases will lead to levels of vulnerability nobody can get on top of it, really buries the lead. It buries the big issue. The big issue is we've got to get to, if we don't get to net zero CO2 emissions before long, there's just going to be problems that nobody can deal with.
This kind of reminds me of, it sounds like a both and for you, Andy, if I'm not, you're saying both of these things. And this is reminding me of the conversation that's happening about pandemic preparedness now and public health infrastructure. So if you look across the world and places where public health infrastructure is really weak, like where there are failed states and people don't have access to basic sanitation, basic healthcare, safe pregnancies, safe drinking water, the ability to, get an antibiotic when you need it, right? Those are also places where you have high death tolls in a pandemic like the one we're dealing with now. And so one of the ways that you could increase resilience and decrease deaths in pandemics is to provide basic public health infrastructure, which, by the way, in much of the US, there's not good basic public health infrastructure. There's health infrastructure. And that will reduce the number of deaths and allow you to contain outbreaks. But it doesn't mean that when there's a virulent outbreak happening like COVID-19 or Ebola or anything else that you don't also have to address vaccine development, containment, testing and tracing and all these other ways of responding to that threat. And I think with climate where we are is that CO2 and fossil fuel emissions are that ongoing active pandemic or outbreak. But there's still this basic level of vulnerability baked into the system that is the reason we're seeing this devastation. And if you look at places like Rwanda, where public health infrastructure over recent decades has been more developed in response to other infectious diseases, and you see that even despite the poverty level, the vulnerability at that basic level has been less than comparable countries, comparably poor areas. You see like kind of that, I think that analogy of what you're talking about, Andy, where it's like you can build resilience or reduce vulnerability, however you want to look at it, and toggle some of those factors so that there are less people harmed, there are few people harmed. And sometimes that's a long-term game. And sometimes I think it can see more immediate results than reductions in emissions. And I think it kind of ties nicely back to the question you prompted us with, Andy, because to me, you started saying, like, what are the times when you actually get a piece of legislation through Congress, or what are those cases? And to me, that's a real missing piece. And I would love to see this group or your conversations or us kind of conspire on how to do more of this, which is how can we show people the art of the possible? And it connects with what Michele was saying about needing to see positives of reduced air pollution for me, right? It's like good for my kids. It's good for my community that there's less pollution. It's not just a faraway problem for future generations. But I think in a more kind of like tactical level, I want to see what it looks like for Congress to do something functional. I want to see what it looks like for a community to do effective overcoming of vaccine hesitancy. And I think to me, that's the connection between these psychological barriers we have when we hear doomsday all the time. We see evidence of doomsday in our democracy, in our public health, in our environment, in our geopolitics. And then we are supposed to feel like we can do something about that. Well, we need more models of what it looks like to do something and when it's effective and how, and to magnify that as I think the counter to gloom and doom.
Absolutely. Some of the best research on risk communications is if you want somebody to do something, you need to show them something that is effective, something that you can do every day, something that is very easy. And I think this idea of examples of where things have worked shows that progress. And I think also that with any action you take, it's important not to just stop with the action, but to track where you're going with that and then share it with other people, not just because as you're tracking, you can see what works and what doesn't, but that sharing the act of doing something that works is incredibly powerful.
I couldn't agree more. And Ray, think we both clearly understand these are interlaced problems. But if you're in the bottom 3 billion people on the planet, for whom the top billion are not doing anything, they're not living up to their commitments under the existing treaties, there's nothing about slowing global warming through CO2 reduction that's going to change their lives. And we can talk about secondary things like reducing city pollution, but you can do that by burning natural gas instead of coal, for example. The thing that we, I think, could agree on is that we are in a world of deep division between people who have really insulated themselves from climate risk through the same technologies, fossil fueled, that allow these two young tourists in Singapore to be at the equator, 80 miles from the equator, and they're in a dome that was that Mediterranean environment. And I was also in Nairobi the same year, and I went to the slum, Atari slum, and these guys are 80 miles from the equator. And I can tell you that their lives will not be improved by anything related to what was being talked about in the mitigation side of COP26, but could be based on the sharing of wealth and sharing of capacity to reduce risk. So climate risk can be reduced promptly. Climate change is increasing climate risk on a longer time scale and needs to be addressed now because, as you know better than anyone, we're committing ourselves to millennia of impacts. But to me, again, if we think about next year's bulletin or just how we frame these problems, I would love to see us not jump to a simplistic framing of climate change as the challenge of our time. It's one of these two challenges. And for anyone who's alive today, who's not on this broadcast, there's work to be done. So thank you all for being here today. I think Bina had to cut out too. And this really does feel like chapter one. I'd love to maybe we could sort of lay the groundwork, lay some rails toward next year's results, next year's doomsday, and see if we can torque that needle a little bit away from where it has been. Thank you all today for being here today, including Jeff Schlegelmilch, who had to leave, and Bina, Ray, Pierre. We got to restart the music sessions because I know we can agree on that for sure, the value of music and driving better outcomes. Michele, Wucker, your books are really a valuable addition to this. And Dan and Sharon, congratulations on surviving another round of the Doomsday Clock setting. This is Andy Revkin, invisible, not in Svalbard, because of camera troubles here in rural Maine, and we'll call it a day, but not call it a year or anything. We have some work to do here. So thank you all for being here today. Go forth.